A screaming child is the one sound money can't buy its way out of. Sadie Larkin had learned that the hard way, waiting tables. And she was thinking it again now as she stood in the service corridor of Castellane with a tray going cold against her hip and a little girl's shriek cutting straight through the walnut paneling of the most exclusive supper club in Chicago. It was the second Friday of January, snow coming down sideways off the lake, and the dining room out front was the kind of place where a bottle of wine cost more than Sadie's rent. She wasn't supposed to look up from her station. New girls kept their eyes down. But the sound reached into her chest and closed a fist around something old, and she looked. At the center table, the one table nobody was ever seated at without permission, a man in a charcoal suit stood over a booster seat and a 4-year-old was coming apart inside it. The girl wasn't crying the way children cry. She was screaming with her whole body, both fists jammed against her ears, her face slick and red and terrified, rocking so hard the heavy chair rattled against the floor. A water glass had already gone over. A busser was on his knees mopping it while pretending very hard to be somewhere else. "Poppy." The man's voice was low, and it did nothing. "Poppy, look at me. Enough now." The room had gone the particular kind of quiet that isn't peace. 40 of the richest, most dangerous people in the city sat with their forks paused, watching, and not one of them was breathing loud enough to be noticed. Because the man standing over the girl was Lucien Marchetti, and you did not draw Lucien Marchetti's attention on a bad night. Sadie knew the name the way everyone in the city knew it. The way you know the name of the weather. Marchetti ran the river wards. People who crossed him became stories other people told to frighten each other, and right now he had one hand flat on the table, like he was holding the table down, and the other hand hovering near the inside of his jacket without ever quite going in. And Sadie understood with a cold drop in her stomach that half the room was afraid he was reaching for the girl, and half the room was afraid he was reaching for a gun. A woman in a grey dress, a nanny, Sadie guessed, from the way she held herself like an employee, bent toward the child and got an elbow in the mouth for it. She straightened up with a hand pressed to her lip and did not try again. "Get her out of here," Marchetti said, to no one, to everyone. A man the size of a doorway peeled off the wall and moved in, and the little girl saw him coming, and her screaming climbed into a register that made a woman 2 tables over set down her glass and leave. Sadie should have gone back to the kitchen. Her manager was already snapping his fingers at her from the pass. Instead, she found herself watching the girl's hands, and what she saw stopped her cold. The child wasn't just crying, she was drowning. That specific private drowning of a kid whose insides are too big for her, and who has run completely out of anywhere to put them. Sadie knew that gasp, the little hitching one, the one that comes when a child has cried so long she's forgotten she's allowed to stop. She'd been hearing that gasp for 10 years, coming through a wall at 2 in the morning, out of a boy who couldn't hear his own voice. She set the tray down on the service stand. She took a cloth napkin off the top of the stack, and she walked out onto the floor. "Hey," her manager's whisper was a knife. "Hey, Larkin back." She didn't stop. Her cheap flat squeaked on the marble, and in a room that's silent it sounded enormous. She felt every eye come to her, felt the doorman-sized guard turn, felt, worst of all, Lucien Marchetti's head come around, slow, and his eyes land on her. She'd been warned about those eyes. Pale grey, like ice over deep water. They looked at her the way you'd look at a stray that had wandered somewhere it would regret. "Who?" he said. "Are you?" Sadie didn't answer him. She wasn't there for him. She crouched down about 4 feet from the little girl, not close, not looming, low enough that her own head was below the child's. She'd learned that a long time ago, too. You get small. You make yourself the least frightening thing in the room. She didn't reach for the girl, and she didn't say a word, because words were the last thing this child could take right now. Another adult voice pushing at her out of the noise. Instead, Sadie started to fold the napkin. She folded it slow on her knee, with her whole attention, the way she'd folded 1,000 of them for a boy who couldn't be talked down but could always be shown something, corner to corner. A crease pressed flat with her thumb. She turned it, folded again, made the little wings, and out of the white cloth she pinched up a bird, clumsy, lopsided, but unmistakably a bird, and set it standing on the floor between them. The girl's screaming caught, not stopped, caught like an engine missing. Sadie tipped the paper white bird forward with one finger so it bobbed like it was pecking the marble. Then she looked up at the child for the first time, and she lifted her hand and touched her own chest flat and made a small circle over her heart. "Sorry." Then 2 fingers to her chin and out. "Okay, signs." The child couldn't know what they meant. That wasn't the point. The point was hands moving gently, saying, "I'm not going to grab you, I'm just here." Poppy stared at the bird. Her fists came down off her ears by an inch. Her breath was still ragged, still gulping, but she was looking, and looking is the beginning of coming back. "It got loud," Sadie said finally, very quietly, not to command her, just laying the words down soft between them. Too loud and too bright and everybody's looking. I know. I hate it too. She nudged the little bird closer. Poppy's hand crept off her own knee and out, and one small finger touched the wing, and the girl went still. Just still. The rocking stopped, the breath dropped down out of her throat and into her chest where it belonged. 30 seconds later the crash came, the way it always comes after that much adrenaline. And the girl slumped sideways, and Sadie caught her the way you catch something you've caught before, without thinking, and the child's wet face pressed into her shoulder and stayed there. The silence that came down over Castellane after that was worse than the screaming had been, because now everyone was looking at Sadie, holding the most dangerous man in Chicago's daughter on the floor of his restaurant, and nobody knew what he was going to do about it. Sadie became aware, distantly, that she was ruining her tights on broken glass, that her manager had gone white at the pass, that she had just, almost certainly, lost the only job standing between her and losing something a great deal worse than a job. She looked up. Lucian Marchetti was crouched now too, down on his heels a few feet away, and the ice was gone out of his face. What was left underneath it was so raw she had to look away from it. He was watching his daughter breathe against a stranger's collar, like he was watching something he'd stopped believing in. She hasn't done that, he said. His voice had gone rough. Slept. Let anyone. Not in a year. He didn't finish whatever he'd started to say. He looked at Sadie's face instead, taking in. She could feel it, the frayed collar, the dark under her eyes, the scar at her hairline she never could cover. Nothing, Sadie said. I just didn't ask her to stop. His men wanted her searched. Marchetti waved them off with 2 fingers and told the room the night was over, and 40 of the richest people in Chicago put on their coats and filed out into the snow without a word. And that was the first time Sadie truly understood what she'd walked into the middle of. They put her in a small warm room off the kitchen with a cup of coffee she didn't drink. The nanny in grey came and took the sleeping girl out of her arms, and Poppy fussed and reached back in her sleep, and Sadie's whole chest ached in a way she didn't have room for. Marchetti came in alone and shut the door. Up close he was younger than the stories made him, 35, maybe, and tired in the particular way of a man who wasn't allowed to be. He didn't sit. He stood with his back to the door and studied her like a problem he needed solved before morning. My daughter's mother died 14 months ago, he said. No preamble. Poppy was 3. She hasn't said a word since, not one. The doctors have names for it. None of the names come with a fix. He paused. She let you fold a napkin and she went to sleep. I've had specialists in that house who couldn't get her to look at them. Kids don't want to be fixed, Sadie said. They want to be believed. Something moved behind his eyes. Where did you learn that? She thought about lying. She was very good at lying. It had kept her and her brother alive for 10 years. But she was tired, and the coffee smelled like the inside of every double shift she'd ever worked, and she said the truth instead. My brother's deaf. Micah, he's 9. Our parents died when I was 19, and I've had him ever since. She turned the untouched cup a half-turn on the table. You learn fast that yelling at a kid who can't hear you is just you making noise for yourself. You learn to show them. You learn to get quiet enough that they'll come find you. Marchetti was quiet for a long moment. I'm going to offer you something, he said, and I want you to understand before I do that people don't say no to me and keep the day nice. Sadie's spine went cold. I have a brother at home who's alone right now, she said. Whatever you're about to make me do, he doesn't get pulled into it. That's the only line I have, and I'll die on it. He looked at her differently after that, like she'd stopped being a stray. The offer, when it came, wasn't the one she braced for. His wife's family, the Serranos, had money older than his and lawyers meaner. They'd never accepted a River Ward criminal marrying their Vivienne, and now that Vivienne was in the ground, they wanted her daughter. The Serrano heir, out of a mobster's house and into theirs. There was a hearing coming. The old men who ran the city's other half, the commission, would sit and decide whether Lucian Marchetti was a fit guardian or a liability to be relieved of his child. He needed to walk into that room looking like a man with a home, a stable one, a woman in it. You'd live at the house, he said. You'd be Poppy's, I don't care what we call it, her person. You'd stand next to me at the sit-down and be my fiancé, and you'd do it well enough that Don Belandi and his friends believe it. 90 days. When it's over, you walk away. He named a number then, and Sadie stopped breathing. It was enough. That was the thing that undid her. It was enough to pay for the surgery the state kept saying Micah didn't quite qualify for. The implant that might let her brother hear her voice for the first time in his life. It was enough to make the aunt in Peoria stop filing paperwork, claiming Sadie was an unfit guardian because she was broke. It was enough to buy back the 10 years she'd spent losing. Micah comes with me, she said. He lives where I live. That's not negotiable. Done, Marchetti said, and she realized he'd expected it, and that told her something about him she filed away. The Marchetti house sat on a bluff over the frozen lake, and for 3 weeks it swallowed Sadie whole. They dressed her in clothes that cost obscene amounts and taught her which fork and how to hold a glass and how to smile without her whole face, and none of it stuck as well as the mornings on the nursery floor. She spent those with Poppy, and she didn't push. She folded birds. She learned the girl loved horses and hated the sound of the ice machine, and slept better with a nightlight shaped like the moon. She taught her a few signs, the same ones she'd taught Micah at that age: milk, more, all done, safe. And one grey afternoon Poppy signed more back at her wanting another paper bird, and Sadie had to go into the hall so the child wouldn't see her cry. Micah loved it there in the uncomplicated way of a boy who suddenly had a lake to look at. He and Poppy invented a whole language between them inside a week, half real signs and half nonsense. And Sadie would find them at the big window pressing their hands flat on the cold glass, laughing at nothing, two kids who'd both learned early that the world doesn't always come with sound. Marchetti watched all of it from doorways. He wasn't cruel. That surprised her most. He was careful with his daughter in the way of a man handling something he was afraid of breaking. And he was correct with Sadie, and only late at night, when he thought no one saw, did the careful thing come off him and leave a man who looked like he was carrying a house on his back. There was one rule. The East study stayed shut, Vivian's room. Sadie didn't ask. She broke it anyway on a Thursday, chasing a runaway paper bird that Poppy had thrown too hard, and the door was ajar, and curiosity is a door that opens both ways. Inside was a woman's whole absence, a grand piano no one played, photographs, and on the desk, spread out like a wound someone kept reopening, a stack of files. Sadie shouldn't have looked. She looked. Police reports. A crash on Wacker 14 months ago. Photographs of a black car, driver's window blown out, and Sadie's hand went to her mouth before her mind caught up to why. Because she'd seen a photograph like that before. She'd seen it in real life, on a wet street in Peoria, 10 years ago, from behind a parked truck with a screaming 3-year-old clamped to her chest, and her own father slumped over a steering wheel. The man who'd done it had walked back to his own car unhurried, in no rush at all, and as he passed under the streetlight he'd rolled his shirt cuff down over his wrist, and on the inside of that wrist, Sadie had seen a tattoo. A raven, wings spread, head turned back over its shoulder. She'd spent 10 years running from that raven. It was why she'd changed cities twice. It was why Micah had a different last name on his school records than she did. She flipped the top file. The method was the same. The unhurried professional nothing of it was the same. And clipped to the inside cover a surveillance photo, grainy, long lens, a man getting into a car, cuff riding up, a raven on his wrist. That room, said a voice behind her, is the one place in this house you do not go, she spun. Marchetti filled the doorway, and the careful was gone, and so was the tired, and what was left she hadn't seen before and hoped never to see again. He crossed the room in 3 steps and took her arm, not hard but not gentle, a grip with a warning inside it. I'm sorry, she got out. The door was open. I was only. You saw nothing. His face was inches from hers. Do you understand me? In this house, people who know things they shouldn't have a way of stopping existing. I know him. The words fell out of her before she could stop them. The man in that photo. The one with the raven on his wrist. I know him. Everything in Lucian Marchetti went completely still. His hand loosened on her arm. What did you say? 10 years ago. Her voice was shaking now. No way to stop it. Peoria. He killed my father over money my father owed to someone I never got a name for. I watched him do it. I had my brother in my arms. He never saw me. I've spent my whole life praying he never saw me. She made herself breathe. That's the man in your file. That's the man who did this to your wife, isn't it? Marchetti let go of her entirely. He stepped back like the floor had shifted. For a long moment he didn't say anything at all, and then, very quietly, his name is Silas Kane. He works for Cyrus Belandi. He turned away, pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes. I've known for a year that Belandi had Vivian killed. I could never put a face to the man who pulled the trigger. He turned back and looked at Sadie like she'd walked out of a fire she shouldn't have survived. You didn't just witness my wife's murderer. You're the one thing in the world that can hang him. Which meant, she understood, standing there in a dead woman's room, that she wasn't just the hired fiancée anymore. She was a loose end, and Silas Kane was still out there, and Silas Kane was very, very good at tying them off. The sit-down was 11 days later. The Marchetti house became something else that night. The fortress opened its doors and let the enemy in under a flag of manners. The commission came in their long, dark coats, shedding snow, and the old men Sadie had spent her whole adult life avoiding stood in Lucian Marchetti's front hall drinking his wine and deciding whether he got to keep his daughter. Sadie wore deep blue. Her hair was up. Vivian's mother's sapphires sat cold at her throat, and Marchetti had stood behind her at the mirror and fastened the clasp himself, and neither of them had said anything about the way his hands weren't quite steady. "Stay next to me," he'd murmured. "Whatever happens. And Sadie, if I tell you to run, and you don't argue, and you get to the children." Don Cyrus Belandi was a silver-haired man with a grandfather's smile and a shark's eyes. He kissed Sadie's knuckles and told her she was a lovely surprise, and then he tilted his head and said, "You know, you've got a familiar look about you, sweetheart. Have we crossed paths?" Sadie's heart stopped in her chest. "I doubt it," she said, and smiled the smile they'd taught her. "I'm from downstate. Nobody remembers anybody from downstate. Belandi's smile didn't change, but something behind it did. "Whereabouts?" Before she had to answer, he turned and beckoned, and a man stepped up out of the crowd behind him. "My associate," Belandi said. "He handles the details." The man put out his hand for hers, and as he did, his cuff slid back an inch. And there it was, black wings on the inside of a pale wrist, and the whole room went to underwater silence around Sadie, while her own past reached out to shake her hand. Silas Kane looked at her face for 1 second too long. She got her hand back. She got a nice to meet you out. She heard herself ask Marchetti from very far away for some air, and she felt his arm come around her and steer her out onto the terrace into the cold, and the second the doors shut behind them, she grabbed his lapels. "It's him." She could barely get it out. "The man with Belandi. Kane. That's the Raven. That's the man from Peoria. That's the man who killed Vivienne and Lucien. He looked at me. He knows me. He knows I'm the one who got away." Marchetti's face turned to something without any warmth in it at all. He started to speak, and the terrace door opened behind him. The nanny in grey stood there, except she had a gun in her back, and behind her, sliding the door shut and turning the lock with 2 fingers, was Silas Kane, and in his other hand, held down along his leg where the party couldn't see, was a pistol with a long black tube on the end of it. "There she is," Kane said, easy as anything. He pushed the nanny down into a chair. "The little sister from Peoria. You've got no idea how many years I spent wondering if I'd left a witness at that car." He smiled. "Don Belandi says hello, Marchetti. He figures the neat thing to do is put your new girl in the ground the same way we put the last one. Break you twice with the same hammer." Marchetti had shifted, without seeming to, until he was standing between Kane and Sadie. "You're one man on a terrace," he said. "You think you walk out of my house, your house?" Kane laughed. "Half your men took an envelope tonight. The other half are watching the front. And your big friend Reyes is asleep in the wine cellar, permanently. Nobody's coming, Marchetti." He raised the gun. "Say goodnight, Sadie." Marchetti's voice was terribly calm. "When I move, the rail. Go over. It's a drop to the snow. Get the children off the property. That's 20 feet. Better a broken leg than what he's offering." Kane's finger tightened, and Marchetti exploded sideways. Not toward his own gun, but into the nanny's chair, shoving it into Kane's shins, and the silenced shot spat and cracked the glass door into a white web. And Marchetti was on him, and Sadie was already over the stone rail with her skirt tearing, and then she was falling. The snowbank took most of it. Her ankle took the rest, a bright, sickening wrench as she rolled, and then she was up on her hands, scrambling, gunshots going off above her now, the loud kind, and she didn't look back because she couldn't. Because if she looked back and Lucien was on the ground, she would stop, and there was no stopping. Because Kane had said, "Break you twice." And if Belandi was making his move tonight, he wasn't only reaching for the fiancée. He was reaching for the air, and her brother was in that house too. Sadie forgot her ankle. She forgot the cold and the blood in her mouth. She turned and ran along the base of the house toward the boathouse, where they'd taken the children for safety. And every step was a fresh white spike up her leg, and she ran on it anyway, because somewhere down that snow-blind path were 2 kids who'd both learned early that the world doesn't come with sound, and she was the only one left who could hear them. The boathouse sat out over the frozen lake on old pilings, its windows dark, and the door hung open into the wind, and that was wrong. That was all wrong. Sadie went in low. The one man Marchetti had left with the children was slumped against the wall by the door, and she didn't stop to see if he was breathing. The big room was full of the shapes of covered boats and the smell of gasoline and cold, and from the far corner came a small, terrible sound. Not a scream. A whimper. Sadie kept her voice down to nothing. "Micah, it's me, it's Sadie." A boy's hands came up out of the dark behind an overturned canoe moving fast. "Man, bad man, here. Poppy hide." Micah's face was white. He'd done exactly right. He'd gotten the little girl down and behind cover and gone still, the way silence had taught him. Sadie dropped beside them and pulled both children in against her and pressed her back to the canoe. Across the boathouse, a flashlight beam swung lazily along the walls. "I can hear you breathing," Silas Kane said into the dark. His voice was calm and it was close. "Come on out, sweetheart. Bring the boss's little prize with you and I'll make it quick for all 3. Make me come find you and I won't." He'd come down the outside stairs while the gunfight raged above. He'd left Marchetti behind him. Sadie didn't let herself think about what that meant. She thought instead, fast and cold, the way she thought when Micah spiked a fever at 3 a.m. and there was no one but her. She had 2 children behind a canoe, a bad ankle, and no gun. Kane had a light, a silencer, and all the time in the world. Straight up, she lost. She lost in the first 3 seconds, so she wasn't going to do it straight up. She turned Micah's face to hers so he could see her hands in the dark, and she signed, small and fast, close to her body where the flashlight couldn't catch it. Breaker box. By the door. On my 3, lights off. Then you take Poppy. That door, down to the ice, run. Don't stop for me. Micah's eyes were huge. He shook his head hard. No, not leave you or my brother, she signed, and you will keep her safe. That's the job. Do the job. She pressed her forehead to his for 1 second, hard, the way Marchetti had pressed his to hers in the study, and she felt the boy stop shaking and set his jaw, 9 years old and suddenly, awfully, a man. She pressed the little moon nightlight into Poppy's hands. She'd grabbed it off the nursery shelf a lifetime ago without knowing why. And she signed to the girl, safe, safe, go with Micah, safe. Poppy's small hand closed around the moon. Then Sadie picked up the thing she'd found by her knee, cold and heavy and orange in the dark. A marine distress flare, the kind that lived in a clip on the wall of every boathouse on the lake. She'd seen 100 of them behind 100 bars and boat docks over 10 years of bad jobs. She knew exactly, blessedly, how it worked. She got her feet under her. Last chance, sweetheart, Kane said. 10 feet away now, the light sweeping toward the canoe. Sadie stood up into the beam. You want the witness, she said, and her voice didn't shake, which surprised her. Here she is. Kane's light swung full onto her, his gun coming up, his dark-adjusted eyes squinting into the sudden white glare of his own flashlight, reflecting off her blue dress, and she held up 3 fingers where only her brother, crouched at the wall by the breaker box, could see them. 2, 1. Micah threw the breaker, and what little light there was died, and the boathouse dropped into total blackness, and in the same half-second Sadie squeezed her eyes shut, turned her face away, and fired the flare straight up into the rafters. It went off like a small sun, magnesium white, blinding, roaring, and Silas Kane, whose eyes had been wide open and fixed on his own flashlight beam, took the full flash of it point blank. He screamed. It was the first human sound she'd heard out of him. He fired wild, 3 shots into the ceiling, staggering back with both hands over his ruined eyes, and behind her Sadie heard the far door bang open and 2 sets of small feet go pounding out onto the ice, one of them dragging the other, gone. Safe, gone. The flare hit the rafters, caught, and the old dry wood took it, an orange light bloomed up the wall. And by that light Sadie saw the door she'd come in through fill with a shape. Lucian Marchetti stood there, soaked in blood that mostly wasn't his, a pistol in his hand, his eyes finding her across the burning room in 1 second flat. He didn't say anything. He crossed the floor, put himself between her and the blinded man clawing at the wall, and he looked at Silas Kane for a long moment in the growing light. You put my wife in the ground, Marchetti said. It was work. Kane got out, blind, backing away. It was only ever work. Belandi made me. This isn't work. Marchetti raised the gun. This is my family. Sadie turned Poppy's mother's face away in her mind and did not watch, and the shot when it came was very loud, and then the boathouse was just fire and wind and the 2 of them standing in it. He turned to her. He saw the flare gun hanging from her hand. He saw the blood on her arm from the glass, the ruined dress, the sapphires still at her throat throwing back the firelight, and something in his face broke all the way open. You came back, he said. I told you to run. You had the drop and the dark and a door, and you came back. They were in here, Sadie said, and then the fire found the gas cans and she stopped talking because he'd already grabbed her hand, and they ran. They caught up to the children on the frozen lake, 2 small dark shapes standing in the falling snow 100 yards out. Micah with his arm around Poppy and Poppy, holding a plastic moon up over her head like a lantern. Sadie went down on her knees in front of them and pulled them both in and didn't let go until her arms stopped shaking, which took a while. Behind them the boathouse burned itself down to the waterline, orange on the black lake, and the sirens came, and by the time the harbor patrol reached them, the flare Sadie had fired straight up through the roof had done the second thing she'd half hoped it would do. It had brought the whole waterfront's eyes to the bluff, and there were witnesses now, and cameras, and no quiet way for Cyrus Belandi to disappear what had happened at Lucian Marchetti's house that night. The evidence that put Belandi away came from an anonymous source who somehow knew exactly which storage unit off the Dan Ryan held 20 years of a killer's careful records. The papers ran it for a month. Reputed crime boss indicted. Contract killings. Witness comes forward. The witness was never named. She'd spent 10 years making sure her name could disappear, and it turned out that was a useful skill after all. She testified from behind a screen. She described a raven on a wrist and a wet street in Peoria and a black car under a streetlight, and she watched the old men who ran half the city stop being able to protect the man in the box. And when it was done, she walked out into an ordinary afternoon and stood on the courthouse steps and understood that she'd finally stopped running. There was nothing left to run from. She'd turned around and burned it down. It was spring before the house felt like a house. The snow went off the bluff and the lake turned blue and unfroze, and someone, Marchetti, she was fairly sure, though he'd never admit it, had the old razor wire taken off the top of the garden wall and let the climbing roses have it instead. The commission had ruled. Poppy stayed. The Serrano lawyers had folded once the man they'd been fronting for went to federal prison, and a quiet order somewhere made Sadie Larkin the legal guardian of a girl who wasn't hers by blood and never would be by anything but choice. Micah heard his first sound in June. Sadie was in the room when they switched the implant on, holding his hand so hard it must have hurt, and she watched her brother's whole face change when the world came in. Startled, then frightened, then as she leaned close and said his name, the name she'd been signing to him for 10 years, and had never once gotten to say out loud into his ear. Something in his expression cracked wide open into pure astonishment, and he said in the flat, careful voice of a boy hearing his own for the first time, "Sadie?" A question, testing it, and she said, Yeah, buddy. It's me. It's always been me." And they both fell apart right there in the audiologist beige office, and Poppy, 4 years old and watching from Lucian Marchetti's arms, reached out and patted Sadie's wet cheek like she was checking something was real. The 90 days had long since come and gone. Nobody had mentioned it. The number he'd promised her had been paid into an account she still hadn't touched, because she'd found she didn't want to leave, and she was too much of a coward to ask whether that was allowed. He asked first. It was an evening in July, the roses out, the lake gone gold, and the children were chasing a dog that Marchetti had pretended not to want, and had gone and bought himself the week. Poppy pointed at one in a book. Sadie sat on the terrace steps watching them, and Lucian Marchetti came and sat down beside her, close, and for a while neither of them said anything. "Your contract's up," he said finally. "I know. You were supposed to walk away 3 months ago." He turned a small object over in his hands, and she saw it was folded paper, white creased. A bird, clumsy, lopsided, made by someone who'd clearly practiced in private and never quite gotten it right. "I keep waiting for you to. I keep thinking one morning I'll come down and you'll be gone and it'll be the right thing, and every morning you're at that window filled food and birds with those kids. And I—" He stopped. "I don't want to hear the house without you in it. That's the honest truth of it. It went quiet in here for a year, and you're the only thing that ever made the quiet stop." He set the paper bird in her open hand. Tucked into the fold of one crooked wing was a ring, not a diamond the size of a headlight, just a thin gold band with a small deep blue stone, the exact color of the dress she'd worn the night she saved his daughter and burned down his enemy. "I don't want a fiancé for a room full of old men," Lucian said. "I ran out of use for pretending sometime around the night you went off that terrace to get to my kid instead of saving yourself. I want the real thing. I want you to stay because you want to, not because I'm paying you to. I want to raise these 2 loud, impossible children with a woman who taught one of them to speak and both of them to feel safe." His voice went rough at the end of it. "Stay, Sadie. Not for 90 days. For the rest of it." She looked at the ring and at the man who'd walked into a burning boathouse to stand in front of her, and she thought about 10 years of running and how tired she'd been for every single one of them. "I come with a brother," she said, "and a lot of baggage, and I'll never once be able to promise you an easy, quiet life." "Good," he almost smiled. "I've got a daughter, a criminal record, and a very short list of enemies I haven't buried yet. We'll match." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit like it had been sized in secret, which, she would learn, it had. Across the garden, the dog knocked Poppy flat into the grass, and the little girl came up laughing. And then, clear as anything, clear as a bell in the summer evening, for the first time in over 2 years, she called out, "Mama, look!" The whole world stopped. Sadie was up and off the steps and across the grass before she knew she'd moved, and she went down on her knees in front of the child who hadn't said a single word since her mother died, and Poppy looked back at her, delighted with herself, holding up a stick like it was a scepter, and said it again, just to feel it, "Mama," and then giggled at the sound of her own voice the exact way Micah had, the way a person does when they finally get to hear themselves. Sadie couldn't speak at all. She, who was so good with words she'd talked her way out of a decade of danger, could not find one single thing to say. She just gathered the girl up, and Micah came running, and Lucian crossed the garden slower, with his hand pressed hard against his mouth, and the 4 of them ended up in a pile on the grass in the gold light with a ridiculous dog, and nobody said anything for a long time, because they didn't need to. It had started with a scream in a room full of people who were afraid of the wrong things. It ended, Sadie thought, holding all of it against her chest at once. The boy who could finally hear her, the girl who'd finally found her voice, the dangerous man gone soft in the grass beside her. It ended the only way it was ever going to end, in a garden full of noise, with every last one of them finally learning how to be heard.